Hello, I'm Jordan. First of all, I wanted to say thank you to everyone who has commented or subscribed to my last video. That's been quite encouraging and surprising, so thank you. I wanted to talk today a little bit about Tolstoy because yesterday I read The Death of Ivan Ilyich. I have uh, kind of a complex relationship with Tolstoy. I have previously read War and Peace and Anna Karenina, and while I certainly liked them, I didn't love them the way that a lot of people love Tolstoy, and I think there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, one of them is kind of trivial, but also kind of not. I feel like his attitude towards women is extremely bad a lot of the time, especially in War and Peace. But even in Anna Karenina, besides the character of Anna herself, there's a very condescending attitude towards women. And in War and Peace, there's even a quote, and it's not coming from a character, it's coming from Tolstoy talking in the text, where he says something that women shouldn't try to engage with men intellectually using their little mental workshops. I think that's the actual term, which is disgusting. But even putting that aside, I'm not the kind of person that's going to write off his entire body of work because of that. Um, there's something, I think it's fair to say that he is a realist, and I've always kind of been adverse to that idea in fiction for whatever reason. There's a David Murphy who has a channel. You should check it out if you haven't. He did a video recently, fairly recently, about Tolstoy, and he doesn't read a lot of fiction. But he says he loves Tolstoy because he believes it when he reads it, and I think that's a great way to put it. The problem is I don't really. That's not what's appealing to me about fiction. I don't really want to believe it, if that makes sense. I feel like that's kind of wasting what fiction can do. For example, I think there's a good video to be made. I'm not going to make it, but there's a good video to be made contrasting The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Tolstoy and The Overcoat by Nikolai Gogol. They're both similar in a lot of ways. They're both about kind of a petty, shallow civil servant coming to terms with his life. But The Overcoat is much stranger, much darker. It's surreal, it's fantastical, it's grotesque and hilarious. This is not really any of those things besides dark. Um, that being said, this is by far the best thing I have read from Tolstoy, easily. Um, it's an extremely good short story. I highly recommend it. So it's about, be warned, there are going to be spoilers in this video if that bothers you. Um, it's about a man named Ivan Ilyich. He's some kind of magistrate, or he's in law. He becomes a judge. But the first section of the story is just kind of an overview of his life, almost like an obituary. But then he gets sick, and it is a absolutely harrowing description of illness and death from that point on. And this is where Tolstoy's power really shows through, which I think is empathy. He's an amazing empathizer. There's a great scene. What's he does wonderfully is, first of all, he does the psychological realism wonderfully, obviously, but also the little details, just the little things that feel absolutely true and real. There's nothing fantastical about it, which is perhaps why it doesn't speak to me in a lot of ways, but it certainly feels pitch perfect real. For example, there's a scene where he knows he's sick at this point, and he knows he might be dying, but he's playing cards. And one of the great things about this character is he's not greedy, he's not mean, he's just petty and shallow. And one of his great joys in life is just playing cards with friends. So he's playing cards with friends, I think it's bridge, and he's got a great hand, but he's thinking about death, so he doesn't care. And then he realizes that he doesn't care anymore, and that just upsets him more. And I don't know, I just found that an extremely powerful scene. But I think what got to me most is the way that Tolstoy captured the absolute loneliness of the experience of dying. In the case of this character, I think the implication is that it doesn't have to be that way, but for Ivan Ilyich, it is, because he hasn't lived his life correctly, is kind of the moral. I do think this is kind of a Christian parable. I'll get to that later. But the main idea is that his life has been built on such shallow foundations that once it's being taken away from him, he has nothing to comfort him. He has nowhere to go. There is one passage, it's a little long. I wanted to read it just to kind of give you an idea of the kind of empathy and insight that I'm talking about here. All right, it says, the syllogism he had learnt from Kieswetter's logic, Caius is man, men are mortal, therefore Caius is mortal, had always seemed to him correct as applied to Caius, but certainly not as applied to himself. That Caius, man in the abstract, was mortal was perfectly correct, but he was not Caius, not an abstract man, but a creature quite separate from all others. He had been little Vanya, with a mama and a papa, and Mitya and Volodya, with the toys, a coachman and a nurse, afterwards with Katenka, and with all the joys, griefs, and delights of childhood, boyhood, and youth. What did Caius know of the smell of that striped leather ball Vanya had been so fond of? Had Caius kissed his mother's hand like that? And did the silk of her dress rustle so for Caius? Had he rioted like that at school when the pastry was bad? Had Caius been in love like that? Could Caius preside at a session as he did? Caius really was mortal, and it was right for him to die, but for me, little Vanya, Ivan Ilyich, with all my thoughts and emotions, it's altogether a different matter. It cannot be that I ought to die. That would be too terrible. Such was his feeling. If I had to die like Caius, I should have known it was so. An inner voice would have told me so. But there was nothing of the sort in me, and I and all my friends felt that our case was quite different from that of Caius. And now here it is, he said to himself. It can't be. It's impossible. But here it is. How is this? How is one to understand it? I think that's fantastic and terrifying and beautiful. Terrifying, I think, is a key word here because this is an absolutely harrowing book. It got to the point, and this is where I think the Christianity comes in, it got to the point where it was so intensely sad, and it's not just a psychologically painful death. He's actually suffering physically tremendously throughout the book. So it just got to the point where it was such a horrendous experience that the thought of crucifixion came to me. And then I thought, well, that is probably intentional. I feel like Ivan Ilyich is a Christ-like figure because his death, by the way, is repeatedly referred to in this book as an act, the act of dying or the act of death. So it's a spiritual act in Ivan Ilyич's case. And this is brought home, I think, by one of the last moments in the book, the moment before Ivan Ilyich dies. He hears a voice. Now, we don't know if it's one of the people at his bedside, his doctor, or one of the members of his family. We don't know if it's in his head or if it's God. But the voice says, "It is finished," which are the last words of Jesus on the cross in the Gospel of John, I believe. And then also, the thing that kind of sets off his illness, oddly enough, is he smashes his side on like a wardrobe or something. And that made me think of the wound that Jesus receives from the lance or whatever. I'm not super familiar with the New Testament on the cross. But anyways, so the idea here is that the death, and this is kind of where the element of hope comes in, the death of Ivan Ilyich is a moment of spiritual growth for him. He comes to realize that his life was meaningless, but that realization is a moment of growth, even if it's at the last second. But also, I think there's a deeper level of hope going on here, and that is the devotion to life, if that makes sense. The very fact that Tolstoy is so devoted to a realistic depiction of the act of living, I do think is an act of hope, especially in a book that's so detailed regarding the act of dying. So anyways, those are my thoughts. Let me know if you've read this, what you think of it. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Also, I'm going to add in the description box a link to Virginia Woolf's essay, if I can find it online. I think I found it there before. Virginia Woolf's essay, I think it's called The Russian Perspective, or The Russian Point of View. It is extremely worth reading if you like Russian literature. So I highly recommend you check that out. Anyways, thank you for watching. I hope you have a good day.